Welcome to the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we are filming in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. We are at the headquarters of Fundación Global Democracia y Desarrollo. And we are talking to His Excellency, Ambassador John William Ashe, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations. But most importantly, the Ambassador Ashe has been elected as President of the 68th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Welcome, Ambassador Ashe.
Thank you, and good morning.
Good morning, and it's a real pleasure to have you here with us in the Dominican Republic. We spoke with you actually last year in our offices in New York as the permanent representative to the United Nations from Antigua and Barbuda, and at that moment the election as the President of General Assembly was not in the cards, or at least we didn't know about it. So really big congratulations on our behalf, and it's an honor to have such a wonderful member of the United Nations with us and presiding the 68th General Assembly.
Thank you very much.
Before we start, I would like to introduce Ambassador Ashe. Ambassador Ashe has been serving as permanent representative to the United Nations for Antigua and Barbuda for the last 9 years. But most importantly, he has been very active in the United Nations system for 25 years and has participated in more than 40 organizations and bodies of the United Nations system. He has also served his country as the ambassador to the World Trade Organization. He has held leadership positions on more than 40 committees and organizations, in particular serving as chairman of the 13th session of the Commission on Sustainable Development. As well, he played an important role in the executive boards of the United Nations Development Program, United Nations Populations Fund, and the United Nations Children's Fund. Last but by no means least, you have also chaired, Mr. Ashe, the executive board of the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol and the subsidiary body on implementation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And more recently, you have had the pleasure to co-chair Rio+20 event. So it's a really long history of being involved with the United Nations at the highest level in most important positions. And before we proceed with our conversation, let us talk a little bit about the General Assembly of the United Nations. We understand that not everybody is completely familiar with what the General Assembly actually does, what it represents, and how important it is in the framework of the United Nations. The General Assembly is the main deliberative policy-making and representative organ of the United Nations. Since the 1960s, a period when many newly independent nations became member states of the General Assembly, it has become more reflective in cultural and ideological terms of the world community we have today. During the initial stages after the United Nations formation, the majority of resolutions had the tendency to mirror the then predominant East-West division of opinion. This invariably led to some semblance of uniformity, which has dissipated, and now the General Assembly encompasses the voices of viewpoints of total of 193 countries, all represented on the principle of one country, one vote. Even though the decisions of the General Assembly have no legally binding force for governments, they do carry the weight of world opinion on major international issues, as well as the moral authority of global governance. Of course, this brings with it its own complications. One of the main difficulties appears to rest on resolutions which receive an overwhelming majority vote, but are not necessarily guaranteed to be adopted. Conversely, the fact that a resolution has been adopted even by a slender margin doesn't automatically mean that it will not be acted upon. The most viable resolutions appear to be those that concern matters upon which all members are prepared to accept a certain degree of compromise and commitment, and that establish goals that countries are able to achieve or to which they have no objection. Like the United Nations itself, resolutions can only be effective as the political will of the membership exists. The task here is to further realize and utilize the mechanisms of democracy in order to achieve the United Nations objectives of universal peace, justice, and human rights, with the elimination of poverty and illiteracy, neither of which should have a place in the 21st century. So with this short introduction to what the General Assembly does, because it does much more than what I mentioned, and its role is even more important, my first question to you, Mr. Ambassador, is, being the President of General Assembly and coming from a small country like Antigua and Barbuda, does that say something about democracy at work at the United Nations?
Yes, I would like to think so. At least I would hope so. What I think it should speak to is the fact that, and you touched on this, that each country in the General Assembly has a vote. So it's one country, one vote. And in theory, at least, every country has an opportunity to serve at the highest elected posts within the UN. That is President of the General Assembly. So I think on those two instances, it would be, I would agree with you.
And tell us a little bit about how the President gets elected to the United Nations, and just briefly an overview, what is expected of a President of a General Assembly? What are some of his duties during the year?
Him or her.
Him or her, thank you for that.
In terms of the process, the position rotates to each of the 5 geographical groups that are recognized within the UN. For 2013-14, it is the turn of Latin America and the Caribbean. So one of the very first steps is that a potential candidate needs the support of his or her regional group or geographical group. In my case, it was Latin America and the Caribbean. Having received that endorsement, then it becomes a pro forma. The next step is pro forma. Having been endorsed by one's regional group, then you are elected by the body as a whole by acclamation. If in some instances, as was the case last year, where there is no agreement within a group, then a more formal traditional election takes place between presumably 2 candidates. So that is the central process. In terms of what the President does, there is, of course, the work of the General Assembly, and there are a number of so-called agenda items dealing with various issues: development, peace and security, international law. So he or she oversees that work. In addition to that, the President announces some of his or her own initiatives that he or she intends to carry out during his or her term. And that is an additional overlay on the normal work of the General Assembly.
So you also come as the President of the General Assembly at a very crucial time. We know that right now a new agenda is being launched, a Sustainable Development Agenda. And as you said yourself, you said that the UN will launch a Sustainable Development Agenda, which may very well be the boldest and most ambitious project that the United Nations ever had to accomplish. We are at a crucial point where the Millennium Development Goals are coming to an end, and there is work on Sustainable Development Goals. There is also an open working group composed of 30 high-level experts that work on a proposal on Sustainable Development Goals and their implementations. So what do you know at this point about the work of this working group, about the agenda, and how are you preparing to tackle the new Sustainable Development Goals agenda?
Let me take the question about the working group. You're referring to the Sustainable Development Working Group, Development Goals Working Group,
yes,
which was one of the outcomes of the Rio+20 process. Right. That group, it's much larger than 30 actually. it's quite a few, have just begun its work. And the intent is for that group to complete its work by September 2014. So throughout the 68th session, which begins in mid-September of this year, that group will be engaged in a series of discussions, exercises, and ultimately negotiations that will hopefully result in a product, these Sustainable Development Goals, by September of next year. So that is essentially the work of the group that you referred to. Where I come in, and this is, I touched on this earlier about initiatives, I have announced that it is my intent to set the stage for the post-2015 development agenda, the one that you referred to as being bold and etc. And that would be in addition to the work that this group is doing. And I'd be looking at a number of high-level events and thematic debates which are intended to sort of flesh out my theme, which is setting the stage for the post-2015 development agenda.
Doing our research about you and what's going on right now in preparation for the General Assembly, we also came across the message by Vuk Jeremic of Serbia, your predecessor, who congratulated you and particularly congratulated you on your 25 years of experience at the United Nations, and really had high hopes in your success and leadership in the next General Assembly. So there is a lot of expectation for the post-2015 agenda. There is a lot of expectation on the follow-up on Rio +20. You also co-chaired Rio +20. What do you think you can contribute to the follow-up of Rio +20, and what would be your points of importance and emphasis in that agenda?
Well, in terms of Rio +20, the outcomes, they have their own defined processes, one of which we have already touched on, the Sustainable Development Group. There is also a group that is looking at financing for sustainable development. So those processes are ongoing. It is not my intent to address them. I am looking at how we can begin the larger process, which is setting the stage for an exercise which by any definition would be an enormous one, defining a development agenda for the UN community.
You mentioned also previously that as the President of the General Assembly, you can also reinforce or bring to table some issues that are of your particular concern, right, and you can possibly do something different that your predecessor, Vuk Jeremic from Serbia, did during the last one. What would be these innovations or new additions that you as the new President would bring to the General Assembly?
Well, each President at the start of his or her term generally announces a theme. In my case, as I said before, it is the post-2015 development agenda, and the importance of getting started if we hope to have one in place by 2015. It is a different direction from that taken by the current PGA. His was more in the peace and security arena. Mine is, for understandable reasons, being from a developing country, and particularly a small island developing state, has to do with, is focusing on development. And that is the significant difference. In terms of approaches, there are certain tools available to a president, one of which is convening high-level events and or thematic debates. All presidents do this. The big difference has to do with the focus. And since I'm in a different aspect of the UN's work than the current PGA, that is where the differences come in.
And talking about non-profits like us, non-governmental organizations, right, As you know, Global Foundation and Fundación Global are both affiliated with the UN system. We really follow closely everything that's going on. We support what the UN is doing to promote democracy, peace, and development in the world. I know that now the Secretary General has started My World campaign, where surveys are going on in more than 60 countries about what is the priority for everyday common people. How can a non-profit like us support the UN in the next year? How can we support your work? And what would you recommend to other non-profits and other non-governmental organizations affiliated with the UN? What to do, how to go about it, where to focus?
Well, the UN has a category in which non-profits such as yourself would fit in. That is the general term that is used as civil society. One of the things that we did learn leading up to Rio +20, and it was emphasized there and subsequent to that event, is that it's impossible for governments on their own to implement a sustainable development agenda. Given the exercise the UN is about to undertake, I think the task is such that it will require other stakeholders. And this is where I think NGOs, foundations, whatever stripe, do have a significant role to play. I, for one, will be looking at how civil society can make specific contributions to the post-2015 development agenda. So I'd hope a foundation such as your own would participate in the discussions that I intend to undertake.
Thank you. And I would like to touch upon a subject that I know that our audience members are interested in, and it's a little bit hot, to say something. It's the subject of the membership. Right now, the United Nations has 193 members. There are 2 members that are in a standby or not possible position. And that has always been a controversial topic in the United Nations. One is Taiwan, province of China, and the other one is Palestine, that has achieved last year non-member but observer status. Is that something that's going to be part of your work? Are you going to participate in it? How is this subject going to be treated in this General Assembly? Or you don't expect it to be treated at all at the moment?
Well, as you know, the General Assembly is a member-driven organization, and the outcomes reflect the general will of the membership. But on the subject of UN membership, it is a 2-step process. It requires the imprimatur of the Security Council, first and foremost, and then that of the General Assembly. So until the first body, the Security Council, acts, it is extremely difficult for the second one, even though it is the truly representative, as you pointed out, one, to take up a specific issue. There are 2 entirely different circumstances with the countries that you, or the aspirants that you referred to. One has observer status at the UN, and also has been recognized by at least one of the organizations, UNESCO. The other is an entirely different situation altogether.
Thank you, Ambassador Ashe. I would like to thank you once again for taking your time. We know that it's a very, very busy time for you. General Assembly starts pretty soon, in less than 2 months. So thank you for taking the time, and it's a pleasure to see you, and we are hoping to continue the conversation at some point during the work of the General Assembly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your visit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching the Global Roundtable, organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we had the pleasure of the company of Mr. Ambassador John Ashe, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations, and President-elect of the 68th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Thank you.